very nice.
My name is Jerome Ferry. My cameraman is Alan Eggers. We're doing a video interview with Virginia Sigmund Myers, a longtime Cedar Rapidian who was very active in social work for many years in the Cedar Rapids area. Virginia, tell us when and where you were born.
I was born in February 29th, 1912 in Columbus Junction. I lived in Iowa all my life.
What was your parents' name?
My father was O.M. Cavan, and mother was Myrtle Fisher Cavan. And her parents had come to Iowa before the Civil War and before Iowa was a state.
What nationality were they?
They were Scotch.
Was you born at home or in the hospital?
At home.
Any brothers and sisters?
I was the youngest of 5, and so
What was their names?
my oldest sister was Alice Cavan Trainer, then Mildred Cavan Winter, Edna Cavan Taylor, and Robert Fisher Cavan.
Was you the closest to any one of them?
I felt very close to all of them, but my oldest sister Alice had been very maternalistic to me always, and since she was 17 when I was born, and took wonderful care of me always.
So you grew up in Columbus Junction.
I did, and then came to Co.
Was Columbus Junction known for anything? Did they have factories or railroads? Or
Yes, they were known because of the railroad junction there. The Rock Island Railroad went both east and west and north and south. So it was active that way.
Was what occupation was your dad?
He had a bank
In Columbus Junction.
in Columbus Junction.
Did back in those days? Did your dad have an automobile?
He loved cars, as did my brother. So they indulged themselves that way. We had twin 6 Packards in succession, I remember. And Bob had a Stutz Bearcat when he was in high school, which was not very good for him.
So they kind of stood out in Columbus Junction when they were
I'm
driving.
afraid so.
What year did you graduate, Virginia? From high school?
1929.
Yeah. Did you give any thought as to when you're in the senior what you might do with your life, or what options were there for a young girl back then?
There weren't many options, but and school teaching, of course, was one of them. But when I came to Co, I had a couple of influential sociology teachers, and I have leaned towards the sociology and economic classes.
Why did you decide on Co?
Well, my sister Millie Winter and her husband were living here. Times were very difficult financially, and I was able to live with them for a couple of years and attend college that way.
This was the start of the Depression.
Oh, yes, yes. And I graduated in the middle of it.
Did you have a part-time job to help you through college?
My last 2 years, I worked for Henry Ristine, who had an insurance office here. And that, even the small salary that was, it paid my tuition.
Like how much would you have gotten paid?
I think I got $7 a week.
And how many hours would he let you work?
Well, I didn't work long hours. I think they ran from 1 to 5 in the afternoons.
So did you live in dormitories later?
The last 2 years, I lived at Voorhees.
Were you active in any sorority?
Yes, I was president of Alpha Psi Delta, and I didn't really participate a great deal in, well, that probably isn't true either. But anyway, I was active that way.
Don't be modest. Were you, I imagine there was a lot of dance functions to attend and social functions?
Yes, mainly at the college because of the Depression times. But it also was the time of the big band era. So,
for instance?
Well, there, Tommy Dorsey, and I remember of hearing Dorothy Lamour with, I'm not just sure which, maybe, I'm not sure what orchestra now it was, but I heard her 3 times one winter between Iowa City and Cedar Rapids.
We had some time back did a interview with Roby Kessler. Was you did you know Roby?
I did, very well, and I can remember a double dating on one occasion with
Really?
her.
Her dad was Professor
Yes,
Hickok?
Dr. Hickok, and I had a government class from him, and remember him saying, which startled me, that a monarchy was the most efficient form of government.
Did you ever get the chance when you were going to college to take any of your girlfriends home to Muscatine on weekends? Or
No. So many of my friends were really from Cedar Rapids, and I was in Cedar Rapids most of that time.
So if you went, did you get home much to Columbus Junction?
Not a lot, no.
And if you did, it'd probably been by train.
Oh yes, yeah.
Uh,
And I remember taking lots of train trips.
what'd you end up getting a degree in?
It was English with sociology as my second.
And you graduated in
32.
1933?
Yeah.
That's when the bank closings were happening?
Yes.
Did this hurt your dad?
Very much, and the bank was closed.
And so what happened to your dad?
Well, he eventually...
Forced to find other work?
Yes, and he sold bonds in Kansas City and then retired to California.
But he did lose his business in Muscatine.
Yes, he did.
So when you got out of your college, what was your first job?
Well, at that time was when Franklin Roosevelt was declaring the various recovery programs and relief measures. And so the relief programs came into effect, and Linn County, which had not received any federal or state money before, began receiving that. So we were really under the national jurisdiction for our expenditures and of funds and all. And I was a caseworker who had a fairly large territory, and saw a lot of miserable situations.
How large of a territory did you have to cover?
Well, it would have, my first one I remember was from the river out to 10th Street East, and I think ended at 12th Avenue from First Avenue.
At your peak, how many caseloads do you suppose you would have been assigned?
Oh, that's a long time ago.
Okay.
And I'm afraid to be accurate about it, but I would guess it was around 200 plus. Maybe.
Now, you were dealing with families that got caught up in the Depression and
Where
that
the
had
men
nothing.
were out of work and hard times had really affected them.
And I can imagine being a young girl out of college, you had the attitude that I'm going to save the world.
Yes, and my ideas changed pretty rapidly.
How little did you know there was so much of that out there?
That's right. That's right. It was a great education.
When did you get your first reality check? That the world wasn't as rosy as...
Well, I have always been haunted by remembering of going into calling on a family in a home where there were 3 or 4 children, and I suspect the parents were under 40, and there was absolutely no heat in the house, even though it was January. And at that time, we were allowed to give them about a half a ton of coal a month, and that had been used up. Well, I felt the depression of the parents so terribly that I went back to the courthouse and wanted more coal immediately. And my supervisor was very cross with me, but I persisted until I got it for them.
Well, I can imagine there was a lot of broken homes.
Very many, yes. It was a hard time on people that way.
So what else did you do for them? Did you try to find jobs for the men?
No, because we had the employment agency, which was a government one, and people were referred and registered there. So that was a separate job. And you would hear a lot of criticism from people who were still working that people didn't want to work. But it was interesting to me that as soon as the war came along and employment was available, immediately the relief rolls emptied for the able-bodied people. Mm-hmm. Most were very glad to get back to work.
I can imagine the WPA.
That's right. I certified people to
Work on the WPA.
jobs.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
In the Civilian Conservation Corps, the CCC.
Right, the young man. Uh-huh.
Mm-hmm.
And they were very, very useful projects at that time.
And people were very appreciative to have a job like that.
Oh, yes, yes. And I always felt the CCC camps were wonderful. Mm-hmm. And they accomplished a great deal. So
Were you familiar at that time with them doing so much work in the Palisades Catholic
yes,
Park?
oh yes. And it was a good feeling, It was one of the good things in a bad time.
And most of their structures are still standing as good as
That's
new.
right.
Mhm.
That's right.
You had or there was such a thing at that time as an Adopt a Pig program.
Well, it was when there was a glut in the market for any swine,
Hogs.
hogs, and so there was first a program that about killing off baby pigs, but then also developed this plan of giving a baby pig to any family who had the correct environment and way of feeding it and taking care of it. So we even drove around to acreages and farms with a pig in the car.
You delivered the pigs.
And we delivered pigs.
Whose idea was this?
Well, probably the Secretary of Agriculture. But it was another attempt to keep people fed.
Did many people take advantage of it?
Oh yes, yes. There was quite a. I think there'd be a lot of people in Linn County who would have benefited from it.
The only bad thing, the children would probably have become attached to the pig as a pet, and then they had to slaughter it later on.
Probably.
Soup kitchens, were they very popular at that time?
Yes, and both at Sunshine Mission in Cedar Rapids and the not Hobby, the 12th Avenue places.
They had one down there.
Yes.
No,
I'm sorry.
it'll come to you. Do you remember who headed up the Sunshine Mission?
Yes, they called him Daddy Ward, and he was a minister and gave shelter primarily to men who needed it, and was a very kindly person and well respected in the community for what he was doing.
After a couple of years of this type of work, did you find yourself getting burned out, or were you still very much?
Well, I don't,
the depression.
I don't think burned out as much as feeling probably
Helpless.
overworked, and also feeling a great need for helping people. Even though I got interested in college, it was this that really made you feel strongly about their needs.
Mm-hmm. So, then when did you get married?
Well, Jim and I were married in 1936.
Did you know each other in college?
Yes, I started dating Jim my senior year, and I knew about his father, but had never met Jim until then. And Chuck Daniel, who sat next to me in one of my economics classes, was Jim's close friend. And when Jim wanted a date for a dance, Chuck introduced us.
Jim's dad would have been Sigmund Myers at that time.
J.G. Sigmund.
J.G. Sigmund, excuse me.
Yeah.
And what did your husband do? Did he have what was his occupation when you got married?
Well, he was an insurance inspector in St. Louis.
Did he get caught up in World War II?
Yes, he did. And because of his hunting background, he was a gunnery instructor.
Where were you when the Pearl Harbor, Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor? Were you in St.
Well,
Louis at the time?
No, we were back in Cedar Rapids, and we were at a birthday party for our son Jay, who was 4 then, and let's see, the Corky Ritkers, and their birthday. Corky's was the 7th of December, Jay's the 6th. So there were a lot of people there when the news came over the radio. It was a sobering time.
Then, when he did get called up, did you stay in Cedar Rapids? Or?
Yes. By that time, I had taken a job with the local Red Cross as Home Service Secretary. And Jim's destination was unknown. And Jay was 5 years old. So I just stayed in Cedar Rapids with him.
And then when Jim got discharged, did he come back and you continued to live in Cedar Rapids?
Yes, we lived in Cedar Rapids the rest.
What did he do when he come back for a job?
He went into the sporting goods business with the John Beck Company, and then later with Armstrong's.
Did John Beck, did they have a outlet or a store here in Cedar Rapids?
Yes, they did. It was on 3rd Street, across from the Guarantee Bank, and had originally been Drew's Sporting Goods.
And then later he worked for the Armstrongs.
And yes, he did.
Did he ever become friends with Mr. Robert Armstrong?
He had known the Armstrongs through his growing up days in Cedar Rapids, and I remember when the Armstrongs were planning to build their house, that Grant Wood brought them up to Wabi because there was a house there that he wanted to use as a possibility and guide for them. And they all stopped after they had seen the stone house and were excited about it. And it was the plan they used. Then I took Mr. and Mrs. Armstrong up there a few years ago because they had tried to find it and couldn't. So
what was his job at Armstrong's?
He was with the sporting goods again.
Yeah. Did you know the Brewer family back then?
I didn't, but Jim did. And in fact, he drove for Mr. Brewer when he was in college.
Mm-hmm. Kind of his chauffeur.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
So during World War II, did you stay active in social work?
Oh, well, I was with the Red Cross, and the Home Service Department was the liaison between the serviceman and the family. So, I think there were as many as 30 volunteers in that group that would call on their families and try to be of help to them.
And did you get involved in notifying families of their children being losing their lives in the war?
We were involved, but secondary to the military announcing to them that. But we filed then the claims for dependent support and all. And I remember one boy who committed suicide on a battleship, but he was only 17 years old. And the parents were both disabled, and the government had cut off, had denied any help. But in correspondence for over a year, I was able to argue.
Did you stay active with the Red Cross after the war then?
Well, not for too many years, a couple I think. And then I helped raise funds after the Cole College Chapel burned.
That was in 1946?
I guess about that. Mm-hmm. And then following that, I was in on the organization of the Linn County Cancer Society, and I was with them until 1974.
Mm-hmm. Would you have been instrumental or with them when they built Howard and Margaret built the radiation center?
Well, they were, Howard Hall was very helpful to us because it was the first real office we had. And he agreed to space so that we could be of help to cancer patients that came for radiation. Mm-hmm. And there were so many out-of-town ones at that time before there were more radiation centers in Iowa. Yeah. Cedar Rapids was the first one in Iowa.
Was you were you and your husband friends with Howard and Margaret?
Yes, we were not close, but they were very friendly and good to us. And always had a Christmas card from them from Florida, and respected them very much.
Well, back then, Virginia, when you got very much into the Cancer Society, was there any emphasis put on the dangers of smoking back then, like there is now?
Not when I first started. And when the figures began to come in as to its devastation, my friends who smoked were very indignant if I supported the idea of smoking causing cancer. It was a long time before it became an accepted idea.
Did you and your husband smoke?
No, we didn't.
Neither one of you did. So, when did you finally retire from the American Cancer Society?
1974.
I can imagine that was a pretty much full-time job.
Very much so. We're a really statewide organization, and so it was not only involvement in Linn County, but in the total programs too.
And then Jim, did he eventually retire from Armstrong's?
He did.
In
1976, 7, I believe it was.
What year did your husband pass away then?
In December of 1983.
This is a picture of Jim in his younger days?
Yes, that was taken at the time he entered the war and left. This is a picture of our son, G. Sigmund II, and who died in 1999 from cancer of the pancreas.
What did your son do?
He was a career naval officer. Graduated from Dartmouth College in 1960 and stayed with the Navy for 25 years.
And this is your daughter-in-law?
It is, yeah.
What was her name?
Her name is Maureen Sigmund.
And her children?
And then
from left to right?
Jay's daughter Sarah, who was being married, and then to my left, or right,
over on your right,
is our granddaughter Amy.
This is Amy with a very large camera. Did she get into the film business?
Yes, she graduated from the University of Montana State, where they have quite an extensive video program. And she works for a company in Virginia who then sell their work to the various mediums and stations.
She didn't happen to meet or have the opportunity to meet Amy Eldon, Russell Knapp's granddaughter?
She had a very lucky experience, which she said was because she forgot her tennis racket when she came to visit. She was scheduled for some tennis lessons here. So I said, don't worry, I'll call the Russell Knapp family. That they're bound to have some extra rackets around. And their granddaughter Amy Eldon was visiting. So it ended up with the two girls playing tennis together and going to movies and enjoying each other very much.
Nice story. Relate your relationship with your father-in-law. He had a very rich history himself, didn't he?
He certainly did. And I remember hearing him speak several times at Cole and always admired him. So it was a double pleasure to have him eventually become my father-in-law. I was very proud of him.
Where was he from?
Oh, the Spalt, Linn County area of Central City in Waubee. He was born on a farm near Waubee, and the Wapsipinicon River bordered part of it. So he grew up loving the Indian tales, hunting arrowheads, and having a very fortunate experience of a friend who shared the same interests and who became a fine mural painter.
Did Jay have a lot of friends in Cedar Rapids, and did he entertain a lot? Was he well liked?
He had many, many friends, but not in the social world. His my mother-in-law did not care for the social life particularly, and was very happy just taking care of her home with Jay and her family, and cooking anything that Jay wanted.
Was Jay and his father close to each other?
Jim and his father, you
Yes,
mean?
Jim, I'm sorry.
Yes, very. And Jim acquired a wonderful knowledge of wildlife and appreciation for the arts, and he was influenced a great deal by his father.
Was Jay involved with the Cedar Rapids Museum of Art, the art museum in Cedar Rapids?
Oh yes, he was. And I don't know at what point he met Grant Wood, but he went to every new exhibit and was very interested particularly in the regional work being done.
Wasn't he one of the founders of the Art Center?
Well, I am not sure about that. I really don't know, but I know he was a great supporter, and he was president of the library board, and I'm not sure but what he was of the art museum at one time, but I'm not. I would hesitate.
Was he into poetry and stories?
Very much so. He was primarily a poet. He had a great sensitivity to other people's problems and the beauty of simple things. He had a very rich life, just appreciating what was around him.
He ended up writing quite a few books of poetry, didn't he, throughout his lifetime?
Yes, he did, and also some short stories. And he did some one-act plays. And Betty Smith, who wrote The Tree Grows in Brooklyn, wrote him after reading one of his plays and asked if they could collaborate on some. And so there are some that are published under both of their names.
Wasn't he active with the art colony up at Stone City?
Very much so. And Sunday afternoons, he would go up and MC their programs. And they would be selling artworks that the students had done during the week, and a general get-together. So he was very much a part of that.
And he was also very well known in literary circles out in the East, wasn't he?
Yes, he was. He had an enormous correspondence with influential writers, and also when in Chicago fairly regularly when there was a group of writers that would meet at a restaurant where they would exchange ideas and stories at the time. They didn't allow any women. Carl Sandburg was one. The outstanding Midwest writers of the time always were there.
Marvin Cohen, was he a friend of Marvin's?
Oh, very much so. They were very good friends, and he admired Marvin very much.
Paul Engel?
And Paul Engel, he really was Paul's mentor in many ways, because first the Sigmunds lived across the street when Paul was very young, and Dad would introduce him to books and poems and stories that he thought Paul would enjoy. And then when the Sigmunds moved out to the end of 4th Avenue, Paul became their paper boy. So Paul would always use their home as his last stop. So he could come in and visit a while, get a book from Mr. Sigmund, and generally, have a visit. And when Paul worked at the drugstore, Dad would, night after night, walk down to sit on a stool there to talk to Paul. And when Paul was in England on the Rhodes Scholarship, Dad kept up his insurance, and they had constant correspondence and were very close.
Your father-in-law, his circle of friends probably involved artists and poets and writers. And,
oh, very much so. Oh, very much so. He was close to many of them. I don't have them listed here.
Yeah, that's okay. And then whenever he would entertain them, his wife wasn't really all that into.
No, she would gladly prepare anything for them, but was not much of a mixer herself.
Grant Wood, the relationship between your father-in-law and Grant Wood, was Grant younger than Jay would have been?
A little bit, but not a great deal. An odd thing is they both died at age 52, which was very young.
At the time that Grant Wood had the milk wagon campers up in Stone City, was this for the art students to stay overnight?
Well, and they used them for their studios, and that was part of the program.
These were milk wagons that went
Yes.
out of business, probably in Cedar Rapids or wherever.
Hadn't been out of business many years, but they were horse-drawn.
And they would paint them. The students would paint them all up with their art.
Yes, it's too bad they weren't kept.
In later years, didn't Paul Engel live in Stone City?
Well, he was living there during the 30s, and his wife's family owned this lovely stone mansion
That burnt down years later.
that burnt years later. And although Paul's work was in Iowa City, he was at the Stone City place a lot.
Mm-hmm. This mansion was across the road from St. Joseph's Catholic Church. That was.
No, I think it was on the same side of the road, but up higher.
Okay. Mm-hmm. You were telling me about your father-in-law taking Sunday drives. What would be a typical Sunday for him to entertain?
Well, more than the Sunday drives were the Saturday ones. And he became very interested in the monastery and the monks' lives, and knew them very well. And even asked if he could come up and spend the life of a monk for 3 days.
Was he of the Catholic faith?
Not at all. But he wanted to know what it was like. And so after that, he wrote quite a bit of poetry about New Mallory and their lives and all. And so on Saturdays, he would call up there, and we would go to the monastery and have lunch and watch one of the offices and go into Dubuque and maybe go into the cathedral to see it.
St. Raphael's Cathedral.
Yes. And then go over to Galena, where he had a very good friend in the antique business who was Jewish. And he was very fond of this man who had come, who was a Russian Jew, and had come to America from Siberia. And he was a large man. And when he first came to New York City and couldn't speak any English, he lived in terror of getting mad at the taunts that were given him for fear he'd really knock some of them out and he'd get arrested. But he always had a lot of good stories.
Did you?
Then we would come back.
Did he ever hit East Dubuque over there?
Oh yes, he did. I remember during Prohibition of him taking us to
A speakeasy,
a
probably?
speakeasy where he knocked on the door and they let us in. He thought we ought to have the experience. Then we would come down for dinner that night on 16th Avenue to one of the Czech places.
You don't remember what the name of the Czech place was, do you?
Well, yes, what's the name of the one on the corner on 14th Avenue to, that bar and restaurant. And then we would often, I have really forgotten what the name
That's okay.
was.
Didn't your father-in-law, didn't he write a poem about Grant Wood one time? One of his poems?
I have found more than one, but there's one that is often used in connection with their relationship that's very nice.
Yeah. Grant Wood was, at one time, he was thinking very seriously of going to French Impressionist style of painting. Your
Yes.
father-in-law kind of changed his mind and steered him in a different direction, didn't he?
Well, it's hard to know how much influence somebody has on somebody else. But, and Grant's roots were predominantly that way. But whenever Mr. Sigmund had the chance, he would, urge Grant to keep to Iowa scenes and landscapes and all. And so one time when Grant was staying with them up at Waubee, they went out for a walk after breakfast, and the neighbor woman had hung her quilts out on the line to air. And Dad said, "Now, Grant, that's what you ought to be painting."
This was really what Grant knew best, was Iowa scenes.
Right. And I think he was firmly rooted and convinced and happy with his decision. He was very comfortable with that.
Was your father-in-law, Jake Sigmund, and Grant Wood, Marvin Cohn, and Paul Engel, do you think, thinking back now, do you think they were recognized as renowned artists at that time, or did that all come to them in later years?
Well, Grant's reputation soared with the Art Institute in Chicago buying American Gothic. And I think from that time on, they probably all benefited some. But it was Grant's sense of humor and some of his later paintings that really became the stamp of regional work for him. I think this painting of Over Florence was done the same summer that he did the quilts. And Grant had just come back from Europe and was at Wabeek and discussing with Dad the art, the way he wished to continue to paint. And that was when they went for their walk and had pointed out the quilts painting, and I think from that was the last of the European work he did. Indian Creek painting was done by Grant, and he gave it to my husband Jim because Jim always gave Grant his bedroom when he visited at Wabeek. It isn't signed, but the artists say that it definitely shows so much of the Grant Wood techniques that it's easily identifiable. Wanda Korn was very partial to that one.
Virginia, when was this particular photo taken, and was this a family gathering or what?
Well, Grant and Sarah Wood were living up at Wabeek, and Grant had just finished his painting of Dinner for Thrashers. Charles Finger, who was a writer from Little Rock, was visiting the Sigmunds, and Sarah decided that they should have a celebration for the completion of the painting Dinner for Thrashers. So she set a table which looks just like the one in the painting with the red check tablecloth, and had a marvelous dinner, as she was an excellent cook. And it was a wonderful afternoon for me, particularly, because as I would listen to the interesting talk.
Can you identify the people in the photo, like in the standing up in the back, starting on the left is Grant Wood?
On the left is Grant Wood, then his mother.
What was his mother's name? Do you recall?
I don't
It's
right
okay.
now.
It's okay.
And then his wife Sarah, and then Charles Finger, who was the writer from Arkansas, uh, Mrs. Mott, and then the niece of Charles Finger, Frank Luther Mott, and J. Sigmund.
Then in the bottom row, starting on the left,
Would be Jim Sigmund, Mary Sigmund, myself, the nephew and niece of Charles Finger, and Mrs. Sigmund.
would you have been married at this time?
No, I don't. We weren't. That was about a year before that.
I have never heard anything mentioned or much mentioned about Grant Wood's wife, Sarah. Was she kind of reserved or?
No, Sarah was not reserved, and was
Maybe just the
starving.
opposite?
But, and of course, the marriage didn't last long. She was, however, a wonderful cook.
How old was Mr. Sigmund when he passed away?
Jay was 52.
And what happened? Was it an accident or?
On his way over to Stone City to preside at one of the Sunday afternoon meetings. Jim was driving the car, and another car came around a corner on the wrong side of the road and hit them pretty much head on. And that Mr. Sigmund landed in the hospital at Anamosa, having to have the ends of 2 fingers amputated. And that's one reason he became fond of the care he had from the Catholic nuns, and then his interest in the abbots and the monks at the monastery.
I think I confused you a little earlier in the tape here, Virginia, when I was asking you about what Jay succumbed to in how old he was when he passed away. You were mentioning a gun accident.
Yes. It was in October of 1937, and it was a cold, rainy day, and Dad had decided to take a day off from work and get out and walk in the woods and hunt. He hadn't hunted for years. He borrowed a gun and went up to Wabi. He shot a rabbit, wounding it, and as he went to retrieve the rabbit, he slipped, and the other barrel of the gun discharged and went through his left knee. He was alone and lost a great deal of blood, and it was only because of a dog barking that a neighbor found him, and he was brought into Mercy Hospital, where they did surgery that night, but he died on the operating table because of loss of blood. And that was the days just before blood plasma was available.
Ironic.
Mm-hmm.
Was you and your father-in-law very close?
Yes, I think we really were.
Did he impress you?
He was always very kindly and good to me, and said he'd always wanted a blonde daughter. And I was so impressed with the way he had friends from all walks of life. And I never will forget when he had his last accident and services, the range of people in Cedar Rapids who came to pay their respects. The blacksmith at Waubee walked all the way down to Grace Episcopal Church. The farmers and the janitors were just as prevalent as the many executives and social people in the community.
Is he still remembered in Waubee today, or haven't you ever been back?
It was interesting in that there was this swell of wanting to do something for him, and they had mounted a memorial in front of the stone store by the river, which says, "To J.G. Sigmund, who by the goodness of his living and the beauty of his writing gave back to the people of the Wapsie Valley so much of the joy they had given him." And then there later was a little park dedicated to J. Sigmund by the County Conservation Commission there.
What a nice story. You had mentioned the fact that your husband Jim passed away in 1983. Did you ever remarry later in life?
I did. In 1990, I was married to Kenneth Myers, who had been a lifelong friend of Jim's, and I had known Ken since our college days. And he had lost his wife, so it was an easy friendship.
Mm-hmm. And then what year did he pass away?
Ken died in 1999.
What Ken do in his life?
His
occupation?
He was a banker. He was with Guaranty for 40-some years, and started during the depths of the Depression, and then became a member of the board and vice president and cashier.
Mm-hmm. Well, Virginia, unless you have any more memories you would like to share with us, the Cedar Rapids History Center, the Linn County Historical Society would like to thank you very much for sharing your memories with us.
You're more than welcome.